The city is probably the oldest, most enduring invention of our civilization. The words are interchangeable: civilization, civil, civic, city. Cities evolve over time. They respond to crises, and historically, they emerge from crises stronger than ever before. So what are the future trends for cities, and what are the lessons of history?
Hi everyone, I'm Carolyn Steel. I'm a London-based architect, and for the last 20 years or so I have been thinking and writing about food and how food shapes our lives. And I've written 2 books about this. One was called Hungry City, which came out in 2008, and that was really about how the city was fed. And I've recently published another book called Citopia, which is basically about an idea that I will talk to you about today, a word I invented, Citopia, which means food place, and I will explain that. As you can see, the subtitle of this book is How Food Can Save the World, which I do realise might sound a little bit extreme, but actually when you understand how profoundly food shapes our lives, you start to realise that food is this amazing tool through which we can ask all the big questions we need to ask. And I think particularly as architects, the sort of the question of how we should dwell, how we should live well, and what is a good society is something we can really usefully ask through the lens of food. So here is the word itself. It just means food place, and it's from the Greek sitos for food and topos for place. And I will explain a lot more about what this means as I go through the talk. But the basic idea is that we live in a food-shaped world, and at the heart of that world is a huge question, which is the question of how we should feed cities. Now, ever since cities have been built, which is about 5,500 years now, this has been an issue. And for me, the clearest image I've ever come across that really describes this problem is this beautiful fresco by Ambrogio Lorenzetti called The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. And what's interesting about this fresco is that it sits on one wall of the town hall in Siena. And so this is really sitting at the heart of the resurgence of urbanity and the reinvention of the city-state. And I remember seeing this image as an architecture student and thinking it was very beautiful, but not really seeing the key point about it, which is that it's all about food, and it's all about this key relationship in urban civilization between the city and the countryside. So if you look a bit closer, you notice certain things. You notice, for example, on the right-hand side, a very heavily artificial landscape, you could say, one that's been modified to feed the city. And then if you look on the left, you can see that inside the city itself, you can see a herd of sheep being driven around. You can see a woman with a basket of eggs on her head and so on. So it's very clear that this apparent division of this red wall down the middle of the image is actually more of a living membrane through which trade and food and obviously money is passing constantly. And the fact that the city and the country is shown as totally balanced in this image is incredibly unusual. I don't know of any other image that does this, which is in itself interesting, because actually once you understand the message behind it, that the effects of good government is to maintain a balance between the city and the country. It's a fantastically important message. Why isn't this an obvious message for all of us? I think one of the reasons is that living in the modern world, we don't actually see the landscapes that feed us. They're often thousands of miles away. I'm from London, and I happen to know that a lot of the food that, I and my fellow Londoners eat comes from landscapes like this one in Brazil. This is actually a soy field in Brazil. A lot of the soy goes to feed animals, and then we eat the animals. So we're much more physically distanced and mentally distanced from the landscapes that feed us than, your average 14th century Sienese, because we can't actually look out of the window and see the landscapes that feed us. I call this the urban paradox. The paradox is, of course, that we think of ourselves as urban. If you ask me where I live, I say I live in London. But actually, because I'm an animal and because I need to eat, you could argue that in a very profound sense, I also dwell in all the landscapes around the world from where my food comes. Now, this is the most profound question in human history, the question of how to eat. It's our deepest practical question, and the shared question, if you like, is how we really evolved as a species through the adoption of increasingly complex technologies that help us in this question. Of course, arguably the most important and profound was the discovery of how to control fire. This is estimated to have happened about between 1.5 and 1.8 million years ago. And of course, the invention of the fire, if you like, is also the invention of home, you could say, in a sense, because it's the invention of a place around which we can gather, and not only that, but around which, of course, we can cook food. And this was a profound moment in our history because it allowed our ancestors to have a ready source of calories available, which meant that if the hunters in the group were not successful that day, they still had a meal where they could take on calories quickly and then go hunting again the next day. So I often say that you hunt, I cook is, if you like, the oldest social contract in human history. And also the shared meal, which, the women of the camp would have gathered tubers and cooked them on the fire, and the men would come back either with or without something that they'd successfully hunted. And then the food would be shared between everyone. We're actually the only species on Earth that sort of shares food in this way, in a kind of a deliberative, calculated, you could say, way, and language evolved to help us do this. So, as I say, I think that the shared meal remains our most profound economy. It's the first economy we ever invented, and it remains at the heart, even though it's invisible in many ways, it remains at the heart of everything we do. Now, it goes without saying that the way we find a solution to the question of how to eat has a profound effect on how we live. And of course, before cities, for most of human history, people didn't live in cities. They lived, I often call it living in the larder. They literally lived in a landscape that was rich enough to feed them, pulling fruit and nuts off the trees, not always with such profound consequences in this case, and following the animals around. And basically it was a kind of peripatetic, a sort of moving existence, because people would, exhaust a territory and then move on to another territory and then maybe only return a year later or something like that. By all accounts, this is a very pleasant existence. Modern hunter-gatherers, very few live now, but the ones who do seem extremely content with this way of life. And of course, it was described in many creation myths as paradise. And the reason for that is that when farming was invented and when farming became the primary way that people fed themselves, a series of profound changes took place in the way people lived. Now, it's arguable, again, I'm sort of romping through vast, amounts of history very, very rapidly. But farming appears to have been invented kind of grudgingly, shall we say. It was the effect of, in fact, the last major climate calamity that the planet went through, which is the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago. The planet was heating up, there was a population explosion, and the very dense forests that people have lived in started to retreat northwards, so that temperate regions like this one in the Mediterranean, basically people couldn't really sustain themselves as easily from hunting and gathering, and they started to turn to other ways of eating, one of which of course was the saving of seed and the planting of it in the ground, and then the eating of the grain. So basically arable farming evolved around this time, not only here in the ancient Near East, and I should explain why it's called the Fertile Crescent, where it's kind of fairly self-explanatory really, but it's an area of fertile land that's crescent-shaped, where the ancient antecedents of the modern grains that we still eat today, such as wheat and barley, naturally occurred, and also around the Indus Valley and also in places in Central America. Farming but starts to be adopted around about this time, and also the building of static settlements near the fields. So basically, if you're going to bother to plant seed and then water it and tend it, you want to be living nearby, ready for the harvest. You're not going to wander off. So this is, as I say, the beginning of much more static human settlements, which get increasingly complex. We have this group up the eastern Mediterranean, including Jericho, for example, where people would still hunt and gather as well. They would leave the city seasonally to go and hunt and gather, but also they would farm. And then finally, this little group of Sumerian cities around the mouth of the basically the Tigris and Euphrates, where they meet, in ancient Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia means between two rivers, is the first group of static agrarian settlements, complex enough that most archaeologists agree they deserve to be called cities. A key takeaway from this image here, however, is that farming and cities co-evolved. There's arguments about which came first. I don't think that's particularly interesting. Well, it's interesting, but it's not necessary to have an answer. The key is that basically you can't have cities without farming, and grain is the food of cities. If we look at what those early cities were like, we immediately notice certain key things. First off, it's very small, so this is about 0.5 kilometre wide. It's extremely dense, so you can see this little area of excavated residential area. The whole city would have been like that. It would have been very, very densely packed with houses. It's on a river, obviously. It's surrounded by farmland, and then in the centre we have this large temple complex, which was not only the spiritual centre of the city, but also its administrative centre. So one of the temple's biggest jobs was to look after the most convulsive moment in the year, which was the harvest, obviously. And it would gather in the grain, offer it up to the gods in the famous ziggurat, store it. You can see this large square building with these striations. That's actually the temple granary, or indeed the city granary, then baked in the city kitchens and then redistributed to the city during the course of the year. So in modern terminology, if we were going to say how did the first cities in the world feed themselves, we would say they were city-states. They used the river to irrigate the land and to manage the water, and in the centre they had a large centralised food distribution hub. Now, this was an incredibly successful model. It got replicated all over the world for thousands of years. And in fact, the first people who really sort of thought in a kind of analytical way about what this relationship meant were the Greeks. This is Aristotle you're looking at here. I love his term political animals because it really expresses a deep dualism in humanity that I think is really essential for architects to understand. Well, all of us to understand, but particularly architects. And this is that we have dual needs. One set of needs is that we're political, which means we need society. That's the Athenian agora you can see on the left there, where people used to gather not only to buy food, but also to talk politics and vote and so on. And on the right-hand side, we are animals, which, as I said earlier, this is the basis of the urban paradox. We need nature, both for our well-being, but also, of course, for our sustenance. So the question, if you're sort of saying what is the ideal home for a political animal, the answer is you need a bit of both. You need society and nature somehow to come together. So how do you do that? Well, the ancient Greeks came up with this word oikonomia. It basically means household management, from the Greek word oikos for house, and nemein, the verb to manage. And both Plato and Aristotle talked about this. They said the ideal city would be one in which every citizen would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm would feed the house. That is oikonomia, it's household management. You basically feed yourself. And of course, if every citizen had this arrangement, then the city would be self-sufficient. And again, both Plato and Aristotle thought this is very important because basically self-sufficiency would be the key to political self-sufficiency and independence. So in order to achieve this, they both argued that the city should remain small, because if it got too big, basically geometry would mean that it wouldn't be able to feed itself from its immediate hinterland. I should mention when I'm here that oikonomia might sound familiar because it's the word that gave us the basis of our modern word economics. Now, as I say, most ancient cities followed this model, but not all of them. Very, very famously, Rome kind of bucked the trend. I call this City 2.0. It's basically the first city to radically outgrow its local hinterland. So we're clearly not practicing oikonomia in Rome. So what are we doing? How is the city feeding itself? Well, the answer is through food miles. And it's quite interesting. We tend to think of food miles as a modern phenomenon, and indeed they are a modern phenomenon, as I was just saying. But they're not only a modern phenomenon. And in fact, it was about 50 times cheaper in the ancient world to transport food or other heavy goods over water than over land. And this meant that for Rome, the only way it was able to feed itself after a while was to sequentially conquer Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage, and then very famously Egypt, because these were very rich grain-producing regions. And of course, grain was the key food for Rome, as it had been for every other city, and about a third of the citizens were fed by the state on a free grain dole called the anana. So it was a really key priority of the city to carry on conquering fertile lands so it could basically get its supplies in. Of course, Egypt was the very famous one because Egypt was so incredibly fertile, and the city exported about 6,000 farmers to Rome, and then basically the Alexandrian grain ships were like the sort of the super tankers of their day. And as you can see from this map, it wasn't just grain that the city was importing, it was also wine, oil, pork, even fresh oysters from Britain at a certain point. So again, what we're seeing here is that as cities start to outgrow their local hinterlands, they can actually affect a landscape hundreds or even thousands of miles away. And this is the first time we really saw this at a big scale. Another interesting thing to say about Rome is that eventually, after extracting all these nutrients from a long way away without putting anything back, the soils of North Africa began to fail. So in many ways, I think it's fair to say that Rome ended up eating itself to death, which is something that many civilizations had done before. Indeed, ancient Sumer did that. So effectively, in some ways, did the Greeks. And of course, it won't be the last civilization to do that either. Now, the first person to really sort of analyse how the productive hinterland of a city would naturally develop was Johann von Thünen, as a German geographer and landowner. And in 1826, he wrote this book called The Isolated State. And he basically said if a city was sitting in a flat, featureless, fertile plain, how would its productive hinterland naturally evolve? And so he basically said, well, so if you imagine this pink blob is the city, he said that around the city you would get market gardening, fruit and vegetables, for three reasons, really. First is obviously that fruit and vegetables are difficult to transport long distances. Second, they're a luxury food, so basically the farmers can afford the high land rent. And third, they can make very good use of night soil, which is human and animal manure, which was collected and dumped on the land to make it fertile. So, of course, in the pre-industrial city, the aim, unlike Rome, which is just a consumer city, was to create this kind of ecological loop. Now, outside that immediate band, there would be grain production, but only for about 30 miles outside the city. And the reason for that is that beyond that, von Thünen reckoned it wouldn't be economic to bring the grain in because transport was so expensive over land. And therefore the city would be limited in the size to which it could grow. And then the final band would be livestock production because, of course, the animals could walk themselves into the city. The one concession that von Thünen made to geography was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, obviously the grain or other foods could go to the river and then be brought in much more easily, and therefore the city wouldn't struggle to feed itself. Now, this is all rather abstract and a little dull. It gets much more interesting when you actually look at real places. This is my favourite example, the comparison between London and Paris. And if you look at these two examples of the main ports in both of those cities, you can see a key difference, and that is that on the left, London has ocean-going vessels coming into the city. So the Thames is a navigable river, and this is a game changer because it means that London was able to import food from all over the world. It was already importing a lot of its grain from the Baltic by the 9th century, and therefore it didn't struggle to feed itself, unlike Paris, which the Seine was not navigable, and the city instead had to impose its will on its immediate hinterland. The king was held responsible for feeding people, and I think we all know how this eventually ended up in the 1780s after a series of disastrous harvests. the king was basically blamed for not feeding his people, and he lost his life, and we had a French Revolution. So, I mean, something very important to say is that the feeding of cities is not only something that shapes the city and the countryside, but it also shapes politics and economics and just a whole outlook to the world. If we look at how London fed itself, as I say, it was a navigable river, and we can see very easily in these 4 maps basically how it did it. So top left, you have just, the city in the 16th century. You can see the market gardens surrounding the city as von Thunen described. Top right, you can see in yellow the grain coming into the city. Of course, it's coming in mostly by river because it's heavy and bulky, to the 2 main river ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate, trying to make its way up to Cornhill, where it's being traded, and obviously being traded on the way, as you can see from this bread street. And indeed, if you look at any city before the railways, you can see the name of food in the streets, because again, what we're seeing now is the way food is coming into the city is literally physically shaping the city itself. Bottom left, the blue map is fish. Obviously, fish are obviously coming in by river as well. Again, the 2 main river ports. Billingsgate, some of you may know, remained London's main fish market until the 1980s. So another thing to say about food systems in cities is that once they're established, they very rarely move. They're very difficult to move. Bottom right is meat. Of course, the animals are walking into the city, so it's a different pattern. They came to a smooth field outside Newgate where they gathered, and that gave Smithfield its name, which was London's meat market for 1,100 years. It's literally just being closed now, which I personally find very sad to be redeveloped. Not only sad, by the way, but also short-sighted, as I'll come on to explain. Here it is. Here is Smithfield when it was still a livestock market, which it was until 1856. And you can see there's a kind of what I call necessary chaos here. I mean, live animals coming to a city. I think London had about 2.5 million inhabitants at this time. This is a really messy, complicated operation. Of course, the animals have to be slaughtered in the city, so they were in fact slaughtered in a series of 184 unregulated slaughterhouses around the market. But the good thing about this is it's visible. You can actually see where the food is, who's trading what. So the city has eyes on the food system. So there's still a kind of degree of political control. That all changes. This is literally 1 year later after that image was made. The coming of the railways really is the game changer. And I call this slide Goodbye Geography because really 3 key things change at this point. The first thing is obviously that up till now cities have been constrained by geography. Paris struggled to feed itself because it didn't have a navigable river. London was fine because it did, and so on and so on. But now, for the first time, food can be transported over long distances rapidly, which means it stays fresh, which means you don't have to walk cows into market anymore. They can either travel on a train as they are here, or indeed they can be slaughtered outside the city and they can come in as dead meat. So cities are emancipated from geography, that's the first thing. The second thing is that food from this point on starts to become invisible, because instead of inhabiting the same spaces as the people of the city, it's going to start travelling down specialist logistical routes. And the third key thing that changes at this point is the politics, because at this point, politicians who hated being in control of the food system kind of wipe their collective brows and say, thank goodness, because the food industries can feed the city for me. These are profound issues that we still sort of really are confronting today. So here is just a graphic illustration of the degree to which London exploded really after the railways came in 1840. On the left, it's barely bigger than the medieval city. Then very rapidly, once the railways come, it becomes this kind of vast, splurging metropolis that you couldn't possibly just feed from 1 or 2 little markets in the middle. Of course, it's not just cities that are transformed at this point, but their rural hinterlands as well. So here we're looking at the American Midwest, for example, which previous to the railways was just a vast expanse of grassland inhabited by an estimated 60 million bison, and of course Native Americans who lived alongside them. Within a decade of the trains coming, the herd has been destroyed. It's often just literally machine gunned from moving trains to make way for effectively the world's first enormous monocultural grain glut, if you like, just thousands of square miles of grain production. And of course, when you've got more grain than humans need to eat, someone came up with the bright idea of feeding them to animals, to cows. Cows actually didn't evolve to eat grain. It actually makes them sick because their stomachs are modified to eat grass. But nevertheless, they will eat grain, just like we'll eat fast food. But it's the creation, really, of industrial food systems and also cheap food, because so much land is suddenly available. Of course, there were consequences of this, not least the Dust Bowl, which was basically the result of 50 years of treating soil as kind of, something that was never ending. But of course, the richness of the soil had been to do with the fact of the way the bison moved across the land and kept it stable and fertilized it with their poo and nibbled the grass to keep it stable. And when you just replace that by annual crops and you plough the soil and so on, the root system is no longer there to keep the soil stable and to nourish the soil. Basically this disaster happened in the 1930s when, after a series of dry years, the topsoil of the American Midwest just basically blew away and created desert. It was the beginning of a raging debate that still goes on today. You could call it the debate of how we're going to feed the world, which I personally find a very unhelpful formulation, but literally the question of how are we going to produce food. On the left-hand side, you see the chemical lobby, if you like, headed up by Justus Liebig, who was the German chemist who first worked out that the key nutrients that plants need are nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus. And the creation through the Haber-Bosch process, so-called, created by two other great German scientists, of how to fix nitrogen to create artificial chemical fertilizers that allows you to grow these vast monocultural crops, because the soil can't do it on its own, because the soil is not being replenished in the system. On the right-hand side, we have the organic lobby, really headed up in the modern era by Sir Albert Howard, who was an English agronomist who first really worked out what was going on in the living soil. And he said, this is crazy. You can't douse the soil in chemicals, because what really matters to plant health is the relationships that it forms in the soil with soil fungi through what are called mycorrhizal connections. As you can see here, what the plant does is it feeds sugars to the fungi, and the fungi, which can extract minerals directly from rock, they feed nutrients to the plant. So it's like a little underground trading marketplace, if you like, for nutrients. But this is what gives the plant its micronutrients and its health. And of course, we then eat the plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants. So that is the basis of health. Now, Howard was actually winning that argument, but unfortunately the war came along, and of course the war was all about creating lots of food rapidly. So the chemical argument won at that point. And then after the war, of course, there was a sort of reinvention of what urban living was really going to be like, happening mostly in America. And of course, it's all around the car. So we get this kind of the creation of landscapes that, you would really struggle to call urban, very, very spread out suburbs. Of course, this is all on prime farmland, because it's all surrounding small towns that would have been founded deliberately in rich farmland so they could feed themselves. But no, you don't grow food there anymore. You drive to a box outside the city where you walk around in what Victor Gruen, the Austrian architect who built this first mall, the Southdale Centre in Minnesota, called Eternal Springtime. And of course, the food itself has also been denatured because it's travelling down these weird logistical routes. And in fact, the human has been edited out of the process too, so the food just sells itself directly off the shelf. So this is really the beginning of our sort of disassociation from food. Food becomes this kind of thing in a packet. You don't really know where it's from or what it is. And of course, you buy far more than you intended and you waste half of it. There are other profound effects in the city itself. This was a map that was done a few years ago of New York, and you can see Manhattan up here with the Central Park, the long rectangle. That's all fine. That's got plenty of fresh food. But just north in the Bronx and Harlem, you can see basically food deserts. These are defined as areas where you have to walk more than 250 metres to buy fresh food. So most people here are living on basically crisps and Coke. So the food is no longer going where people are in the city. It's actually going where the money is. Now, all of this is to do with the invention of this thing called cheap food that doesn't actually exist. We're paying less for our food than at any time in history, and we're doing it because we've chosen to externalise the true costs of food. So we have lost and degraded farmland, we have huge climate change emissions to do with the way we farm, deforestation for cattle grazing or feed for cattle. We have a huge depletion in global water supplies, a lot of it from non-renewable resources. 2 billion overweight or obese, many of those also undernourished. This is a historical first, that you can be fat and undernourished at the same time. About 800 million people globally don't have enough to eat at the same time. Eutrophication, this middle picture here, which is basically to do with excess runoff from chemical fertilizers, which basically starve lakes and river deltas of oxygen by creating these algae blooms. Of course, vast amounts of food waste, up to 50% is being wasted in Western countries, and this is because we don't value food, obviously. We're feeding about a third of the grain and legume harvest to animals, and we could feed 10 times as many of us as we just ate the grain directly. 10 calories of energy being expended for every calorie you consume, and this huge, really devastating, life-threatening, globally threatening sixth mass extinction that we're heading into, because basically, again, a combination of climate change and the use of chemicals in farming is destroying insect and bird life. So, as I say, there is no such thing as cheap food. This is what happens when you try to create the illusion of cheap food by externalizing its true cost. And just to say, I mean, it's obvious when you think about it, but food actually consists of living things that we nurture and kill so we can live. So food is life. So basically, if you don't value food, you don't value life. This is fairly obvious. Unfortunately, this industrialized food system that evolved in America is now going global. There are various reasons for this. First of which is that there's huge power now, huge consolidated power in the food companies, many of which are bigger than national GDPs, have profits greater than national GDPs, and of course all the profit in food is in selling us highly processed foods like this. And by the way, our brains can't resist this kind of stuff because our brains are still hunter-gatherer brains. And that was all the case before COVID. I think COVID's really interesting because it sort of throws very, very bright light on many of the things that may have been hidden to people before. So, for example, when India locked down, it just turned out there were 47 million people who were living in cities and working in cities, but actually their real home was the village back home. So there was this mass migration, and of course many people died on the way because the government gave them very little help. Of course, COVID itself is a result of our very out-of-kilter balance with nature, and this is both to do with the fact that we're encroaching on wilderness where we shouldn't be, but also the radical reduction in biodiversity, which is the result of the way we feed ourselves. It's also exposing massive social inequality, as you can see bottom left with all of these delivery drivers in Bangkok, socially distanced, but waiting to pick up food to take to people who can afford to stay at home. And of course, we discovered as well that, even the food that's grown in the UK is not harvested by English people, British people, because we basically don't harvest our own food anymore. And there were 93,000 Romanians who normally come every year, but couldn't come because of the lockdown. And of course, this was also true in every developed Western nation. Not everyone, sorry, but I mean many, such as the UK, Germany, the USA, and so on. They couldn't get their migrant labour to pull the food out of the ground. Many people are saying this, COVID is at an extraordinary moment for a rethink. It just shows us that our lives are out of kilter, and I think there's no better way of asking the question than this wonderful quote of Cedric Price's, in which he says, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And what's really interesting when you ask that is that the question really hasn't changed. It goes back to the beginning of my talk when I was saying, the question of how to eat and how to live through the way that we eat hasn't gone away. And it's very interesting now, if you look at many utopian models and thinking, how relevant it is now becoming, because we've entered what I would now call a neo-geographical age, in which we can no longer ignore geography. We have to really start thinking about it again. And this makes all of these pre-industrial sort of thoughts about the city and its relationship with the countryside incredibly interesting again. So we have Plato and Aristotle arguing the city should remain small. We have Thomas More's utopia, in which he wants to go back to the city-state and say that we have to sort of re-establish this link between the city and the countryside, again keeping cities small. Ebenezer Howard is really Thomas More with railways. He's trying to solve what I call the urban paradox, which is bringing the city and the countryside closer together by limiting the size of the city and having a dedicated area of farmland around it. Now, these are all utopian visions, and when I was researching utopia about 15 years ago, I came across a sort of description of what utopia actually is, and it told me that it's got this kind of joke etymology. It can either mean a good place or no place, because of course it's an ideal, and I remember finding that really depressing, because we need to be able to think in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live. And then it occurred to me, well, food gives us that, because food shapes our lives, it shapes our bodies, our minds, our habits, our homes, our cities, our landscapes, our economy, our politics. It's all shaped by food. So why don't we just think about all of these big questions that we face through the lens of food? And I invented this word, Satopia, that I showed you at the beginning. So how do you do that? Well, we have to eat. So where does the food come from? Are we going to have cows, as in top left, eating grass, which is the reason we co-evolved with cows and sheep, by the way, is they can eat grass and we can't, and then we can eat them. This is what we call a beautiful synergy. If we feed them on food we could eat ourselves, as in the concentrated animal feeding operation on the right, or a CAFO, it's lose-lose. Because we could be eating the grain ourselves, it's making the cattle sick, it's actually altering the quality of their meat, so it's not good for us anymore, it's full of omega-6s rather than omega-3s, and of course we have to pump them full of antibiotics, so it's an ecological disaster. In fact, I'm going to come off the fence now and say we just have to stop producing meat this way. The other kind of meat, however, is very useful in an ecological system, which I'll come on to in a minute. Do we go into the middle of a city and meet people as we historically did when, we need to get hold of some food, which is basically the beginning of markets and public space in cities? Or do we leave, drive out to a box in the name of efficiency, or these days just kind of dial up a curry on our phones? Do we take time to sit around a table and talk to one another, which again is how we evolved as a species and you could argue is the basis of a good life? Or are we too busy to eat? And before lockdown, one of my favourite statistics was that 20% of meals in America were being eaten in a car. The question, of course, is which of these answers to all of these different stages in the food system actually give us a good life? For me, it all comes down to value, the fact that there is no such thing as cheap food, and it's ironic somewhat that it's only in times of crisis that we tend to remember what the true value of food is. And here are some examples historically. On the left, London during the Second World War, people growing vegetables in Kensington Gardens in the centre of the city. Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, Detroit after the cars left. These all saw massive resurgences in people growing food, food networks, awareness of food and enjoyment in food again. And of course it's happening under COVID as well, so these are some examples from the UK. They also happened all over the world actually. A rediscovery of neighbourliness, people looking out for each other, a rediscovery actually of the joy of food and the fact that maybe cooking with your kids and taking time over it was rather a wonderful thing to do. Of course, not everyone could do this, and I do realise this is a mostly middle-class discovery, but of course that doesn't mean it wouldn't be desirable for everyone if we decided to try and build society along these lines. Bottom left, new food networks springing up because basically many small producers could no longer sell directly to restaurants. And bottom right, a massive resurgence and interest in growing your own food. So these are all, if the previous set of slides I showed about COVID were about fragility, these are all about resilience, and ironically were things that I was already arguing for before COVID. I love this concept of Carlo Petrini's. He's the founder of Slow Food, of co-producing food. So instead of just being a passive consumer sitting back waiting for your curry to be delivered by delivery or whatever, you actually go out, you meet the farmers, maybe pay them in advance, Top left is a community-supported agriculture farm, the biggest one in America. You pay the farmer in advance to feed you. Maybe you go and help him on the farm, or her. Park Slope Food Co-op has been going for about 50 years, basically set up by a series of volunteers. And basically they work for 4 hours in the shop per month. And for that, they get food that's much cheaper, but it's actually very high quality food, and it's from the local region. We all know what organic boxes are, and a lot more people have been using these under lockdown, of course, buying directly from your producer. And also sort of community food hubs like this one in Canterbury in the UK, where basically it's part farmers market, part permanent display, part just somewhere to kind of go and hang out. But basically reproducing the role that food used to have in the city of bringing people together, as in the Athenian Agora, arguably the greatest public space ever produced. For me, it's really important, if we're going to try to create a good lives for people, good societies, what I call a good landscape for human flourishing, which is obviously to do with ecological loops, to do with zero carbon, we have to have food front and centre of our thinking. Of course, that's already happening in many parts of the world. There are so many amazing examples of what's known as food planning. So basically, top left, growing food in the city. This is Ben Flanner, who's the first person in New York to start converting industrial space back to agricultural with Brooklyn Grange Farm. Toronto Food Policy Council, again, the first Western city to embed food in its political thinking. Union Square Market in New York, again, just farmers markets making space in the city for people to bring food in and to buy directly from producers. But also infrastructure is really important. So this is a family-run abattoir, a small-scale abattoir in New York State. And this matters because we need to go towards regenerative farming models. And this is about reproducing a kind of filigree network of food production as well as consumption. Food-based redevelopment of the city, like this wonderful scheme in Antwerp by Pact, which is basically a combination of things. It's food growing, community food growing, commercial food growing, a farmer's market, but also a lot of food-related businesses re-inhabiting old industrial buildings. And of course, bottom right, vertical farms will probably be part of this, but if you think back to your Fontunen, they're only the little bit in the middle. They're only the sort of the market gardening-y bit, the luxury foods being grown and sold in the city for a high price. They will never replace all the acres of, if you like, arable land and grain production that a city actually needs. And that's just plain geometry and economics, and the urban paradox, of course. Really important that we start feeding ourselves differently and farming differently. There's incredible models out there. It's actually a very exciting time in farming right now. There are big movies coming out called Kiss the Soil and things like this that are actually talking about how all of this works. Agroforestry, so sort of this is all about farming with as opposed to against nature. This argument is over. We have to stop farming with chemicals. This means mimicking nature again, finding clever ways to do this. We can do it with technology, not against technology. Mimicking the forest in a forest garden, mob grazing, bottom centre, which is mimicking what the bison used to do in the grasslands. You can bring desertified areas of grassland back by doing this. Ideas of permaculture, how we can sort of coexist with nature in the rhythms of our life as well as the patterns of our life. And the idea that we kind of refit the countryside with modern infrastructure, which is, again, not a modern idea. It's something that Peter Kropotkin, one of Ebenezer Howard's great models, was arguing for. And, of course, the internet is a key part of that. Last but not least, of course, it is going back to the old utopian idea of balancing the city and the countryside. And of course, there are ancient models of how to do this. It's been part of urban thinking from the beginning, but there are modern ones too. Patrick Geddes, 100 years ago, talking about preserving the countryside so the city grows into a star shape. Byrne and Viljoen, UK architects who are talking about what they call continuous productive urban landscapes, which is basically inhabiting empty space like car parks and grass verges with productive land and joining them up to create ribbons of productive land out to the countryside. Bottom left, interrogating the latent productivity of a city region, as this study did by Urban Design Lab around New York, sort of saying what could be grown in this region, then how can we create the market so this is actually what New York eats. And of course, building new cities with, again, food at the centre, as MVRDV are doing in Almere Oosterwald, where they're incorporating food growing in their vision for the city. For me, it comes back to this. It comes back to the fact that a good society is one in which everybody eats well, because you cannot live well if you're not eating well. But if we do eat well, everything else follows from it. And it is radical. It's a new politics, a new economics, a new vision of the relationship between the city and the countryside, a new vision of how we live and how we share. But all these things are absolutely vital if we're going to create resilient, low carbon, equitable societies in future. So for me, food is just the absolute best way of bringing all the complexities of all the things that we have to think about together in one place. So it's about seeing through food. That is what Sitopia is. And if you want to know any more, it's all in here. Thank you very much.